They expected you to come back. They expected the silence to break the same way it always did, with you reaching out, with you checking in, with you trying to fix something they never fully explained. But this time, you didn't. And that's the moment everything starts to shift. Because when an avoidant pushes an empath into silence, they think they've gained control. But what they don't realize is that silence doesn't just create distance. It creates something far more dangerous for them. It creates uncertainty. And avoidants don't handle uncertainty the way you think they do. Let me ask you something. Have you ever stopped chasing someone and suddenly felt like they were the one becoming restless, not reaching out directly, but showing signs, watching your stories, appearing in places you go, acting different when they see you again, like something inside them shifted? If you've felt that, then you've already seen the beginning of what most people never fully understand. Because this isn't about love, it's about control. And once that control disappears, something inside them starts to collapse, but not in the way you expect. See, avoidants don't run because they don't care. They run because closeness activates something uncomfortable inside them, something they don't fully understand. When things get emotionally intense, they create distance. That distance gives them relief. It makes them feel safe again. And when you chase them, you unknowingly help them maintain that balance. You move closer. They move away. You try harder. They detach more. And somehow, the connection stays alive in this push-pull cycle. But here's what most people miss. This dynamic only works as long as you keep playing your role. The moment you stop, the entire system starts to break. And this is where it gets interesting. Because when you go silent, when you stop reacting, when you stop chasing, you remove the one thing they were relying on without even realizing it. Predictability. They knew you would come back. They expected your energy. They counted on your consistency. But now, there's nothing. And that nothing starts to feel louder than anything you ever said. At first, they'll tell themselves it doesn't matter. They'll act like it's fine. They'll distract themselves. Stay busy. Stay distant. Stay in control. But something else happens beneath the surface. Something they don't talk about. Something they don't even consciously process. Their mind starts to loop. Why didn't you reach out? Why are you different now? Did something change? Did you move on? And this is where it changes. Because now, they're the ones experiencing what you used to feel. Uncertainty. And uncertainty is one of the most uncomfortable emotional states for an avoidant. Not because they can't handle emotions, but because they can't control them. You see, avoidants don't fear losing you the way you fear losing them. They fear losing control over how they feel. And silence takes that control away. Now imagine this. You used to text first. You used to check in. You used to be emotionally available even when they weren't. And then one day, you just stopped. No explanation, no drama, just absence. At first, they might not react, but give it time. Because their system isn't built for immediate emotional expression, it's delayed. And when it hits quietly. They start revisiting memories, small moments, conversations, things they ignored before suddenly feel different. And this is where most people misunderstand what's happening. They think the avoidance suddenly realizes your value. But that's not exactly it. What's really happening is that the emotional distance they created for safety is now being mirrored back at them, and they don't know how to process it. Because now, they're not in control of the distance anymore. You are. And that shift feels threatening to their internal system. But something deeper is happening too. Something rooted in the subconscious. From a psychological perspective, avoidants often operate from patterns formed early in life, where emotional closeness felt overwhelming, or inconsistent, or unsafe. So they learned to detach, to self-regulate, to rely on distance instead of connection. But here's the paradox. They still crave connection. They just don't know how to stay in it without feeling overwhelmed. So they manage it. They control it. They create space when it gets too real. But when you go silent, you remove their ability to manage that distance. Now it's not their choice anymore. And this is where their internal conflict begins. Because part of them wants to stay detached, but another part, the part they've been suppressing, starts to surface. And that part doesn't like the silence. Not because they suddenly became emotional, but because the silence forces them to feel something they've been avoiding. Loss of control. And that's where the collapse begins. Not externally, internally. But something else happens, and this is where it gets even more important. Their perception of you starts to change. You're no longer predictable. You're no longer chasing. You're no longer emotionally available on demand. And suddenly, you become uncertain. And uncertainty creates curiosity. Curiosity creates attention, and attention pulls them back in. Not always through words, but through energy, through behavior, through subtle shifts you can feel but not always explain. For example, imagine you run into them after weeks of silence. Before they were calm, detached, unbothered. But now, something feels different. They look at you longer. They hesitate. They seem slightly off, not because they don't care, but because they don't understand what changed. And that confusion is something they're not used to feeling. Or imagine this, they start watching you more closely, not reaching out, but noticing, paying attention to what you're doing, who you're with, how you're acting, because now they're trying to regain a sense of control they've lost. And this is where most people make a mistake. They think this is the moment to go back, to respond, to reconnect the same way as before. But if you do that, you reset the entire pattern. Because the moment you become predictable again, they go back to feeling safe in distance, and the cycle repeats. Distance, chasing, connection, distance again. But if you stay in your silence, not as punishment, but as awareness, something deeper begins to shift. Not just in them, in you. You start realizing something most people never reach. That your value was never in how much you chased, but in how much you understood your own emotional patterns. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Because now, you're not reacting. You're observing. You're not trying to fix the connection. You're understanding it, and that changes everything. But here's the part most people don't talk about, and it might change how you see this completely. Silence doesn't just affect the avoidant. It reveals you to yourself. Because when you stop chasing, you're forced to face your own discomfort, the urge to reach out, the need for closure, the habit of fixing, and that's not easy. But it's necessary, because this isn't just about them collapsing. It's about you evolving. And when that happens, the dynamic doesn't just shift, it transforms. But something else happens, and most people miss this completely, because at a certain point, it stops being about whether they come back, and starts becoming about why you ever chased in the first place. That realization is where your power really begins. But let's go deeper for a moment, because what looks like their collapse isn't always obvious from the outside. They don't suddenly send long emotional messages. They don't always confess how they feel. In fact, most of the time, they do the opposite. They go quiet. But internally, their system is doing something very different. It's trying to restore balance. And this is where the psychology becomes important. Avoidants regulate emotions through distance. It's their way of staying in control. But when that distance is no longer theirs to control, their internal stability starts to shake. Not dramatically, subtly, like something underneath them is no longer steady. And this is where it gets uncomfortable for them, because now they're feeling something they usually avoid: dependency. Not dependency on you as a person, but on the emotional pattern you created together. The pattern where you chased and they distanced. That pattern made sense to them. It was familiar. Safe, but now that pattern is gone, and without it, they don't know where they stand. And this is where their behavior starts to shift. Not always clearly, but in ways that feel different. For example, they might suddenly become more present when they see you, not overly emotional, but more aware, more attentive, like they're trying to read you, trying to understand what changed. Or they might test the waters, a small message, a casual interaction, something that seems simple on the surface, but carries a deeper question underneath. Are you still the same? Do I still have access to you? And this is where most people miss what's really happening, because it doesn't look like a collapse. It looks like curiosity. But that curiosity is driven by something deeper, loss of emotional control. Now imagine this scenario. You used to always reply instantly. You used to show up consistently. You were predictable. And now you're calm, neutral, not distant, but not chasing either. And when they interact with you again, they don't feel the same dynamic. There's no pull from you, no urgency, no emotional leaning. And that creates tension inside them. Because now, they don't know how to position themselves. Before it was simple. They step back. You step forward. But now, you're not moving. And that stillness forces them to confront something they've been avoiding. Their own emotional response. And this is where it gets deeper. Because from a subconscious level, this dynamic is tied to identity. Avoidants often see themselves as independent, self-sufficient, not reliant on others. But when they start feeling affected by your silence, that identity gets challenged, and that creates internal conflict. Why am I thinking about this? Why does this bother me? It shouldn't matter this much. But it does. not because they suddenly became attached in a traditional way, but because the emotional structure they relied on is no longer working. And this is where their shadow begins to show. The part of them they don't usually face. The part that does want connection. The part that does feel loss. The part that does notice absence. But instead of expressing it directly, it comes out indirectly. Through behavior, through subtle actions, through moments that feel almost out of character. For example, they might bring up old memories randomly. They might act warmer than usual, then pull back again. They might create situations where they accidentally run into you. Not intentionally obvious, but not completely random either. And this is where most people get confused, because it feels inconsistent. Mixed signals, hot and cold. But it's not random. It's conflict. Internal conflict playing out externally. Part of them is drawn in. Another part is trying to maintain distance, and that push and pull is their version of collapse. Not breaking down emotionally, but losing their usual sense of control. And here's the part that changes everything. They don't collapse because you disappeared. They collapse because you became emotionally unavailable in a way they didn't expect. There's a difference. Disappearance can be ignored, but emotional neutrality can't be easily controlled because it reflects something back to them, a version of you that no longer revolves around them, and that's what disrupts their system. Now let's bring this into real life again. Imagine this. You're in a shared space, maybe work, maybe a social setting. Before, they knew how you would act. They understood your energy. But now, you're composed, grounded, present, but not leaning toward them. And they notice it immediately, not consciously at first, but emotionally, because something feels different. They might try to engage you casually, and when you respond, you're kind, but not invested. And that contrast creates a gap they don't know how to close, and this is where their internal dialogue starts to shift. They've changed. They're not reacting anymore. I can't read them like before, and when they can't read you, they can't control the situation. And when they can't control the situation, they feel something they're not used to. Vulnerability. But something else happens here, and most people completely miss it. Your silence doesn't just create distance. It creates respect. Not forced, not demanded, but felt. Because when someone no longer chases, it signals something powerful. Self-control, self-awareness, emotional stability. And those are things avoidants recognize, even if they don't openly admit it. Because deep down, that's what they struggle with. And when they see it in you, it changes how they perceive you. You're no longer just someone who cares. You're someone who understands. And that shift is what makes them pay attention in a different way. But here's where you need to be careful. Because this is the moment where your old pattern will try to come back. The urge to reconnect, the urge to respond differently, the urge to fix things now that they're reacting. But if you fall back into that, you lose the one thing that created the shift, your awareness. Because this was never about making them come back. It was about breaking the pattern. And patterns don't break through action. They break through non-reaction, through stillness, through clarity. And once you reach that point, something changes inside you permanently. You stop asking, why are they like this? And start asking, why did I accept this dynamic for so long? And that question leads to a different kind of answer. Not about them, about you, your patterns, your emotional habits, your need to fix what wasn't yours to fix. And that's where your real transformation happens. Because once you understand your role in the cycle, you gain control over it, not by changing them, but by no longer participating in what keeps it alive. And when you step out of that cycle, the dynamic doesn't just weaken, it disappears. But here's the final realization, the one most people don't expect. Avoidants don't collapse because they lost you. They collapse because they lost the version of you that made their distance feel safe. And when that version is gone, they're left with something unfamiliar, a connection they can't control, an absence they can't ignore, and a reflection of themselves they can no longer avoid. And once that happens, they have two choices: return to old patterns or face something deeper within themselves. But either way, you're no longer the same person they once knew. And that is the moment everything truly changes. And once you reach that point, something very quiet, but very powerful happens. You stop waiting, not in a forced way, not in a I don't care way, but in a grounded way, like something inside you finally understands that your energy is not something to be negotiated anymore. And this is where the final shift begins, because up until now, part of you was still watching them, still noticing their behavior, still analyzing their signals. still wondering what it all means. But awareness doesn't stop at understanding them. It completes itself when you return back to you. And this is where most people never arrive, because they stay stuck in the middle. They stop chasing, but they're still emotionally attached to the outcome. They become silent, but internally, they're still hoping. And that subtle attachment keeps the pattern alive, just in a quieter form. But real freedom doesn't come from silence alone. It comes from detachment, not coldness, not indifference. Clarity, the kind where you no longer need a response to feel complete. And when you reach that state, something interesting happens. Their behavior stops affecting you. Whether they come back or disappear completely, your internal state doesn't shift the way it used to. And that's when you realize this was never about winning them back. It was about breaking something inside you that believed you had to chase to be valued. And once that belief dissolves, you don't just change one connection, you change every future one. Because now, you recognize patterns faster. You feel imbalance earlier. You don't ignore red flags just because you feel something. And most importantly, you don't abandon yourself to keep someone else. And that's where your real power is. Not in making them feel your absence, but in no longer needing to. But let's go even deeper for a moment, because there's something subtle happening on their side, even long after the silence. Something most people never see. Avoidants don't process emotions in real time. They process them later, alone, in moments where there's no distraction, no noise, no external control. And when that happens, memories don't show up the way they did before. They feel different, heavier, more detailed, because now there's no emotional buffer protecting them. And that's when realization begins to form. Not always clearly, not always consciously, but internally, they start connecting dots. Moments where you showed up, times where you were consistent, ways you tried to understand them. Things they once dismissed now carry weight. And this is where something unexpected happens. Respect turns into reflection, and reflection can turn into regret. Not loud regret, not dramatic, but quiet, the kind that lingers, the kind that shows up when it's too late to act the same way again. But here's the truth most people don't want to hear. That realization doesn't always lead to change, because awareness and action are two different things. They might understand what happened. They might even feel it deeply, but that doesn't mean they know how to do something different, because their patterns are not just habits, they're protection mechanisms. And breaking those requires something most avoidants struggle with, sitting in emotional discomfort without escaping it. So sometimes they don't come back, not because they don't feel anything, but because facing it requires them to confront parts of themselves they've avoided for years. And this is where your final clarity comes in, because now you're no longer interpreting their silence as rejection. You understand it differently, as limitation. And that changes how you see everything, because you stop personalizing what was never fully about you. And once you stop personalizing it, you stop carrying it. And when you stop carrying it, you become lighter, more stable, more present in your own life. And this is where something shifts in a way you didn't expect. You start attracting different energy, not because you're trying to, but because you're no longer operating from the same emotional pattern. You're not chasing. You're not overgiving. You're not trying to prove your value. You're just being. And that state is what healthy connection recognizes, because real connection doesn't require pursuit. It responds to presence. And once you experience that difference, you can't go back, because now you know what it feels like to not lose yourself in the process. And that's the final realization. Avoidants don't collapse to teach you something about them. They collapse to reveal something about you, your patterns, your boundaries, your emotional depth. And once you see it clearly, you don't just understand the connection, you outgrow it. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with awareness. And that's what makes it permanent. Because growth that comes from awareness doesn't need closure. It becomes closure. And when you reach that point, you don't look back wondering what could have been. You look forward, knowing exactly what you will never accept again. And that quiet certainty is something no pattern can take away from you. Because now, you're not reacting to connections anymore. You're choosing them. And that is where everything truly changes. Not for them, for you. And once that shift happens, there's no going back.